A rhythmic, hollow tap. Kalen kept his thumb pressed against the retraction mechanism of his data stylus, letting it snap back and forth in the silence of the great hall. The bioluminescent patterns along the vaulted ceilings pulsed in a slow, calming rhythm, a visual reinforcement of the supposed serenity within the Aurelian hegemony. Below the azure light, Princess Lyra Vane walked the polished floor to complete the binding. It was supposed to be pure political theater. The ancient ritual required a royal to select a guardian from a lesser, subjugated species, demonstrating imperial benevolence to the galaxy. She walked past the armored, hulking warriors of the Outer Rim. She ignored the telepathic envoys shivering in their atmospheric suits. She stopped in front of the Terrine. Captain Silas Thorne. Kalen's thumb stalled on his stylus. A Tier 9 classification meant the Terrines were biologically unexceptional. Aurelian evolutionary doctrine stated that Tier 9 species possessed entirely static genomes, lacking the adaptive DNA that allowed apex species to process and project raw energy. They were fragile, entirely dependent on external technology to survive. This perceived biological stagnation was precisely why the binding was considered safe. A Tier 9 could never physically threaten their royal counterpart. Yet, earlier that morning, Kalen had delivered a diplomatic schedule to Thorne's quarters. The human had been sitting by the window, casually turning the pages of a physical copy of the High Aurelian history text. It was not a digital translation. It was the original, complex script, bound in heavy fibers. Thorne had traced the ancient runes with a calloused finger, his expression unbothered by the sheer density of the dialect. Kalen had catalogued the moment as a statistical anomaly, a quirk of an overeducated soldier, and moved on. Now Lyra was legally binding her safety to that anomaly. If you want to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the surface of the galaxy's greatest empires, subscribe to join our archival records. 3 weeks later, the air inside the Nexus Prime Diplomatic Summit tasted like ozone. Kalen stood behind the secondary perimeter pillars, cataloging the arriving delegates on his datapad. The static electricity generated by 300 high-tier Aurelian officials in one enclosed space made Kalen's skin itch. The Terrine stood exactly 4 paces behind the princess. Kalen watched Thorne through the lens of archival behavioral analysis. The human was entirely still, completely devoid of the microtremors that usually afflicted lower-tier guards in this environment. Most lesser species fidgeted under the crushing, ambient pressure of High Warden Malachur, who currently dominated the center of the summit floor, his mere presence bending the light around him. Thorne did not look at the High Warden. He did not look at the royal dais where Lyra sat, nor did he scan the approaching dignitaries like a standard bodyguard. He isn't looking at the royal dais, he's calculating the... Kalen's data stylus slipped from his fingers, clattering sharply against the marble floor. Thorne was mapping the structural weak points of the entire facility. Kalen watched the human's eyes track from the exact load-bearing columns to the primary atmospheric vents, then count the blind spots between the automated sentry turrets. It wasn't the protective gaze of a guardian watching for threats. It was the cold, surgical precision of someone who had already figured out how to collapse the room. Across the hall, High Warden Malachur raised a heavy, gauntlet hand to signal the start of the proceedings. The bioluminescent patterns on the walls flared violently. Thorne slowly shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. High Warden Malachur's voice cut through the ambient static of the hall. He did not ask for order. He dictated a change in regime. He declared the royal lineage obsolete. Armed shock troopers stepped out from the arched corridors, their heavy boots cracking against the marble in perfect synchronization. The air pressure dropped as the summit dissolved into an execution ground. The royal guard hesitated, their loyalties fracturing under Malachur's authority. Kalen slid down the wall, clutching his knees to his chest. Malachur raised both of his heavily armored hands. The surrounding air warped around his gauntlets as he drew ambient energy directly from the facility's power grid. The High Warden unleashed a massive telekinetic shockwave, a concentrated, building-level blast aimed directly at the dais to vaporize the royal line and any remaining loyalists in a single stroke. Thorne stepped into the trajectory. Kalen squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the smell of flash-fried organics. A Tier 9 physiology couldn't possibly withstand that kind of. The roar of vaporization never came. Instead, Kalen heard a low hum of resistance. He opened his eyes. The terrain was still standing. Silas caught the crackling kinetic wave with his bare hand. Kalen watched in absolute horror as the human skin seemed to ripple and harden, microfractures in his cellular structure breaking and instantly rebuilding themselves to accommodate the impossible energy load. This was the adaptive DNA the hegemony insisted did not exist. Silas held the violently unstable energy in his palm, rotated his shoulder to absorb the kinetic recoil, and slammed his glowing fist directly into the primary control console governing the solar spear network. The console shattered under the catastrophic overload. A shockwave of displaced air blew Kalen backward. The shock troopers surged toward the dais to protect Malachur. He tore them apart. Silas moved. It wasn't a chaotic brawl. It was an anatomical dissection. He slipped inside their energy shields, driving his knuckles into unshielded pressure points to collapse windpipes. He shattered an Aurelian's kneecap with a sweeping kick, using the falling soldier's momentum to break the formation. Kalen watched from behind the shattered perimeter pillar as the supposedly fragile Terran soldier moved not with the untrained desperation of a lower-tier species fighting for survival, but with the cold, perfectly practiced rhythm of an apex predator executing a well-rehearsed eradication protocol. Within 20 seconds, High Warden Malachur was pinned to the floor, his armor fractured, a human boot resting casually on his throat. Above them, the ruined console triggered its automated failsafe. Massive holographic projections filled the smoky air. It was not a structural diagnostic. It was a sprawling, heavily encrypted database. The Ilari archives. The records hovered in the harsh blue light, detailing centuries of systematic cultural extinction orchestrated by the hegemony to maintain their perfect, benevolent image. Kalen stared at the original High Aurelian text floating above the destruction. He finally realized why the human had been reading it in his quarters. Silas had not been studying their history. He had been translating their confessions. The Terrans had known the truth the entire time, and they had patiently waited for the hegemony to invite them inside. Silas stood in the center of the ruin, wiping blood from his split knuckles. Kalen pressed his back against the cold stone, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. The elegant, bioluminescent patterns continued to pulse in their slow, calming rhythm, entirely indifferent to the fact that the beautiful, rotting empire beneath them had just been hunted by its own prey. If you want to survive the shifting tides of galactic power, join us here tomorrow for another transmission from the dark edge of the cosmos.